All right, we're going to get on chapter 2 of Africans and Native Americans, the language and evolution of red black people. Chapter 2 is the intensification of contacts, transatlantic slavery, and interaction after the 1500s, the arrival of slaves in Spain and Portugal. All right, let's get into it. So, it will perhaps be surprising to some readers to learn that the greatest degree of intensive contact between Americans and Africans did not occur initially in either the Americas or Africa, but rather in European cities such as Lisbon, Seville, and Valencia. Okay, so they're talking about Spain. So they're telling us most of the interactions in this time period was happening in Spain with all this mixing, and I guess that could be where the confusion might come from. But let's continue. So this contact has not heretofore been studied for a variety of reasons. One of the principal ones being the myth that the enslavement of Americas was a temporary phenomenon. Okay, so temporary as in it was like, that was a long time ago. It's no longer a thing. It was temporary kind of thing. Okay, so another reason, equally mythical, is the notion that in modern times, slavery and Negro slavery were virtually synonymous concepts. Okay, so one and the same, pretty much. That's that you can see how that gets confusing when you kind of put it all under one umbrella. So slavery was quite common in the Mediterranean world in the 13th and 14th century. In Iberia, Islamic laws recognized slavery, and Muslims were even allowed to hold other Muslims as slaves if the latter were black or loro, of intermediate color. In Christian Barcelona, one finds numerous slaves between 1275 and 1288, classified as a Morolorum, Muslim or intermediate color, Saraceno Blanco, White Saracen, Saracenum Negrium, Black Saracen, Saracenum Loram, Saracen of intermediate color. Oh my god, they got more. Saracen album, White Saracen. So that's a lot of slicing and dicing. In the 13th century, Barcelona had many Tartars. Is that the same as Tartaria? The Tartars from Tartaria? That sounds like it makes sense. So in 13th century, Barcelona had the Tartars, Greeks, Bulgarians, Bosnians, Albanians, and so on as slaves, including an esclavo blanca tartara, white Tartar slave. In the 14th century, Muslim slaves became more common again, and one finds many white, loro, intermediate, and black slaves. In 1493, Simon, an Ethiopian slave, killed a Russian slave. Turkish and Tartar slaves were also present, along with many Russians, Bulgarians, Sarts, probably Sardos or Sardinians, and others called Abguas, Argesis, Circassians, and so on, probably from the Caucasus Mountains. In 1429, 2 runaway black slaves were recaptured in Redon, France. Interesting. I gotta highlight that. Okay, just a quick reminder for myself. So, but others escaped to Toulouse. Yeah, I like these little details. where slavery was not recognized. Between 1243 and 1296, of 50 slaves listed in Barcelona, 18% were loros, 10% were black, 20% were Saracen only, and about 52% were blanc, white. In province, a Saracen noir, un esclave blanc. Oh, bro, I can't be with all these. I might just skip all the different languages, unless it's like all like mainly Spanish. But I'm not trying to struggle with all this. I just want to read it. Let's get through it. So I might skip some of the stuff. In Provence, these folks were all sold as slaves in the 15th century. Okay, this characterizes slavery in the period with white, black, and brown European, African, and Asian slaves being treated equally the same, and with a tremendous ethnic variety. Let me read this again. I felt that like it was a little choppy. This characterizes slavery in the period with white, black, and brown European, African, and Asian slaves being treated basically the same, with tremendous ethnic variety, as we see. Although most were from the Balkans, the Black Sea region, or Northern Africa. In 1266 to 1271, several olive-colored slaves were sold in Genoa, while of 48 slaves named between 1401 and 1499 in that city, 25 were white, 15 were black, 6 intermediate or olive, and 1 was Indaco or Indian, and 1 intermediate or brown. Wow, that's a lot of keeping up with folks color and just classifying them. Like, that's crazy. Like, they're like inventory. So there were many Tartars and other Eastern slaves in Italy during that period, along with a substantial number of blacks and others from North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. In Portugal, slaves of Muslim background were present in the 13th century, along with some who were Christians who lived in an Arab fashion. They're called mocarabes. Now, during the 14th century, Portuguese vessels began to raid the Canary Islands, and many Canarios were introduced as captives, along with additional Muslims. So they was running through spots back then, and if you just so happen to cross paths with these ships, man, it was either or. You fighting, or you giving up, or you escaping, or you captured. It's like, damn. So let's keep going. Along with additional Muslims. Okay, we read that. Now, in the 15th century, Berber and black Senegalese, the Wolof slaves, black Senegalese Wolof. The Berbers and black Senegalese slaves became common, especially after 1440 and 1450. During certain periods, the term Saraceni was synonymous with servi or captivi, slave or captive. More corresponded to a freer slave Muslim, morus, while later slaves were known as negro or genio, prieto, or sobre todo escravo. The slaves as a class might be called, depending on the time period, Saraceni or negro or preto or slave. Quite early in both Portugal and Spain, the status of a child was determined by the status of the mother. If the mother was a slave, the child was also a slave. Okay. In the western Mediterranean, the slave trade was dominated by the Genoese and Castilians by means of slave factors in Fez, Morocco, but slaves from the east were also introduced. East as in Asia, or okay, so in 1455, for example, a Tartar slave was mentioned in Seville. At about that time, however, the Portuguese began to dominate the black African trade by successfully reaching Agadir and then Senegal in the mid-15th century. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V permitted the Portuguese to enslave infidels, pagans, and enemies of Christ. By 1479, the Portuguese were dominant insofar as black slaves were concerned, but Canarios and Muslim slaves continued to be obtained by the Spanish directly. So I'm thinking by 1452, Pope Nicholas V permitted the Portuguese. Is this different from the Papal Bull, or is this around that same time period? I'll get to that. Side note. Now, for a long period of time, Muslim slaves continued to arrive in Seville and other Spanish cities, some from Granada and others from Algiers, Oran, and other places which were raided in North Africa. Canary Islanders were also shipped in by the Spaniards, who had replaced the Portuguese as the oppressors of the Canarios. It must have had to have been a war or something, right? Because I wouldn't see them just agreeing to give up their main source of exportation or import, whatever. Thus, all during the 15th, 16th, and 17th century, the slaves of the Iberian Peninsula were of all colors and of many nationalities, including Greeks, Slavs, Turks, Egyptians, Asians, Indians, Americans, and so on. A Portuguese expedition to the Gambia in 1457 took with it an Indian interpreter, Jacob. The Christian Castilians possessed slaves of many kinds in the 13th and 14th century, most of whom were moros or morenzos, children of Moro, perhaps Moreno, or Mores. Okay, so I guess these two are different. Forgot. Some were classified by color, as in Catalonia, while a few in 1266 were called Mamelukes, slave in Arabic, especially soldier slaves. In 1475, a royal order established for Seville the position of Mayorol, juez de todos los negros y loros, libres y captivos que son captivos e oros en la Sevilla. Y'all get it. Maybe you could pause this, Google Lens this, and you'll get the drop there. Thus, in 1475, Juan de Valladolid, a black of noble ancestry, was appointed as the judge and mayor of the blacks and loros, the browns, of the Seville area. Yeah, let's get here. Let's do that. That's interesting. All right. So good. Thus, in 1475, Juan de Valladolid, a black of noble ancestry, was appointed as the judge and mayor of the blacks and loros of the Seville area, with authority over their communal life, whether they were free or slave. That's okay. I'll read about him. I'm gonna look into him for a future video, Now, this policy of self-government for blacks and browns conformed to the established Castilian and Aragonese policies towards free Muslims and Jews, each community of which had its own laws and courts separate from those of the Christian community. Bro, that's interesting. Okay. Shoot. That's news to me. Man. Right. So this policy of self-government for blacks and browns conformed to the established Castilian and Aragonese policies towards free Muslims and Jews, each community of which had its own laws and courts separate from those of the Christian community. Now, I just want to highlight this part now, but alright, because this is right here. This is what you want to look into. Castilian and Aragonese policies. These were coming from the black Europeans of this time period, which is, I think, quite interesting, right? Because they say it was separate from the Christian community. And now, 2025, it's like Christian community is the overpowering, society, or not society, or religion, especially in America and in other places of the world, right? So back then, it was separate. That's interesting. Now, okay, let's keep going. This attitude of tolerance and autonomy was later abolished, but it set a direct precedent for later policies favoring American autonomous pueblos in the Americas after the 1520s. In any case, American slaves were probably integrated into the non-white community structure in Seville. Thus, the arrival of American captives after 1493 did not in any sense present a new spectacle. Both Spaniards and Portuguese had become accustomed to financing their wars and expeditions by seizing men, women, and children wherever possible. This is not to say that it was at all clear that all such captives were legal slaves, especially if they were not taken in just war, but in practice, laws were often ignored. One finds, for example, Christians captured by Muslims being treated as slaves in Spain if purchased from Muslim slave dealers. In the records which have been published from Seville and Valencia, possession seems initially to have always been accepted as proof of the right to sell a slave and for the authorities to impose a tax on the sale. Columbus was the major supplier of American slaves prior to the 1500s. As noted earlier, he caused some 3,000 to perhaps 6,000 slaves to be sent to Europe. God damn. That's like as big as my city high school had like 3,000 people. So that's a lot. Mind you, doubling it 6,000, and these are probably like what they call conservative numbers. It was probably a whole lot more, right? Man, whatever. That's fucked up. To be sent to Europe, and also, if we are to believe that his plans were implemented, to the Azores, Canaries, Madeira, and Cabo Verde Islands. Okay, so they sent them from America to all these islands. Is what they're saying, right? Columbus was the major supplier. Yes, that's what they're saying. So from America to the Azores, the Canaries, the Madeira, and Cabo Verde Islands. By the year 1500, However, a great escalation began in the shipment of Americans across the Atlantic, since other Spaniards and the Portuguese became directly active. In the 1500s, Americans were directly transported to Europe from the Caribbean islands, from the coast of South America, and from the Terra Nova region. 3 major new sources of slaves were thus opened up, and if it is necessary to examine this subject before proceeding to an analysis of what happened, I'm going to read that again. 3 major new sources of slaves were thus opened up, and it is necessary to examine this subject before proceeding to an analysis of what happened to the Americas when they arrived in eastern lands. As mentioned above, Gaspar Corte Real and João Fernandes were among Portuguese navigators from the Azores who reached the Newfoundland Greenland area in 1500 or perhaps earlier. Fernandez may have taken captives to the Azores, but if so, no record exists. In October 1501, however, Corte Real sent some 57 captives to Lisbon. Their description is worth noting. Alright, so pause and Google lens this right here. We're going to continue. Thus, the Americans were slightly taller than the European observers. They resembled gypsies with their faces marked in signs like those of the Indians. Well, the Americans are the Indians, right? That's what they're saying. Thus, the Americans were slightly taller than the European observers. They resembled gypsies with their faces marked in signs like those of the Indians. That's a roundabout way of saying the Americans are the Indians. The hair of the males, who were darker than the females, was long and curly, and their eyes were greenish in color. Thus, it is quite possible that these Americans were part Norse Greenlanders or part Breton or Basque. We do not know exactly where these green-eyed Americans came from, whether from Newfoundland or Labrador. However, they were in possession of what appeared to be part of a sword and jewelry manufactured in Italy. This tends to confirm early contact with Europe, as discussed above. In 1501, Miguel Corte Real sailed back to the Terra Nova region, where he disappeared. One of the ships returned to Portugal with certain men and women whom he found. In 1503, the Portuguese sent out 2 ships, and thereafter the Newfoundland area was visited regularly, so much so that in 1506 a royal tax was imposed on the fishing catch. The Bretons, English, and perhaps Basques were also active in the area, but that will be discussed below. Slaves from Terra Nova showed up in the slave markets of Seville and Valencia very soon after 1500. In Valencia, during the period of 1516, we find in 1503 Miguel, age 20, and Man, age 10. In 1505, Juan, 16, and Pedro, 16. In 1507, Antonio, 8, and Juan Amarco, 18. In 1515, Ali, now Melchor, 20. In 1516, Catalina, age 28. These 8 slaves were, with one exception, all obtained from Portuguese sources. They were all classified as Negroes, with the exception of Juan and Pedro, called simply slaves. In Seville, between 1510 and 1515, some 13 Terra Nova slaves were registered and sold, including, in 1510, Isabel, age 20, Cristobal, age 20, Vergita, age 17. In 1511, there's Pedro, who's 20, Anton, who's 25, Felipe, who's 14. In 1512, Pedro, who's 25, Catalina 18, Anton 25. Hold up, these are the same folks. 13, Fernando 20, Maria 25, and 14, Francisca 14, and in 15, Maria, who's 20. 2 of these slaves were categorized as Negroes, 1 as Loro, and 10 as slaves only. In 1525, a Spaniard, Esteban Gomez, made a voyage up the Atlantic coast of North America, bringing back many Indians as slaves. Allegedly, they were set at liberty, but perhaps some Terra Nova slaves after 1525 were derived from Gomez's voyage. Okay, now interestingly, between 1548 and 1560, some 20 slaves from Terra Nova appeared in Peru, out of 256 who can be identified geographically in the records. Between 1560 and 1650, about 143 slaves from Terra Nova showed up in Peru, coming by way of Iberia, probably. An additional 11 were classified as bozales. Not familiar with the Spanish language or culture at all. Bozales. Well, shit, me neither. What the hell? Let's go ahead and highlight that. Okay. I'll keep doing that. Alright, so the location of Terra Nova has heretofore been a matter of debate, with writers generally placing it somewhere on the west coast of Africa. Is Terra Nova on the west coast of Africa, y'all? I don't know. I might as well look into it. Terra Nova, west coast of Africa. On the other hand, there's a very strong evidence that Terra Nova was, at least in the first half of the 16th century, Newfoundland. Now, Newfoundland is by like Canada, right? Okay, so first, Antonio Brasio, in his collection of Portuguese missionary documents and royal communications relating to Africa between 1471 and the 1500s, does not mention any place called Terra Nova. On the other hand, in a contract written in the Canary Islands in 1543, a reference is indeed made to a black slave as being a native of Terra Nova de Guinea. I will argue, however, that whenever Terra Nova is mentioned without de Guinea, it refers to Newfoundland. Okay. First, although the Portuguese referred to Brazil as La Terra Nova, the new land, in 1500 thereafter, they virtually always used Terra Nova for Newfoundland. Documents relating to Terra Nova were found in the Torre de Tombo in Portugal. What the hell? Portugal, and Terra Nova is used repeatedly by Portuguese source of the 16th century for Newfoundland or Cape Breton. The Ruche map of 1503 has Terra Nova on it and reflects Portuguese nomenclature. Many other maps, including that of Verrazano, 1524 to 29, also uses Terra Nova for Newfoundland. This usage persisted so that in the 1630s to 46 period, Brazilian Portuguese were referring to O Comercio Terra Nova in codfish. We're referring to commercial codfish. Let's just go with that. Comercio com a Terra Nova in codfish. There was regular trade in fish between Terra Nova and Recife in Brazil. Okay, let's see where that is. For the Spanish, Terra Nova was used consistently for Newfoundland. Early maps used by the Spanish, such as the Oliveriana of 1503, the Pissarro charts, and the Ruche map. Ruche map. That's a hard word, bro. It shouldn't be. Ruche. Let's just go with that. Located Terra Nova at Newfoundland. The Ribeiro map of 1529 places Tierra Nova de Contrail near Cape Breton. In 1511, Spanish royal correspondence relates to a voyage to Terra Nueva, using Breton pilots. Spanish royals correspondence relates to the voyage using Breton pilots. Interesting. What the hell? Breton pilots? This usage continued as Martin Navarrete of 1829 entitled a section of his work Sobre las navegaciones de los vascongados de los mares de Terra Nova. He cites documents from 1561 referring to Newfoundland as Tierra Nueva and Terra Nova. Finally, Lafarga Lorzano, in his work on the Basque, uses Terra Nova for Newfoundland without classification, including references from the 1690s. Okay, I'll look into my guy Lafarga Lorzano. He did work on the Basques, and I don't know much about the Basques. So the French, it may be added, also use Terra Nueva or Terra Nufe consistently for Newfoundland. Thus, we must, it seems, acknowledge the fact that for the Spanish, Portuguese, and French, Terra Nova was the proper name for Newfoundland, and that slaves from Terra Nova would have to have been from that area unless specified as being from the very obscure Terra Nova de Guinea, especially before 540. It should also be noted that Terra Nova fell outside of the realm of Spain in practice, and for a time was thought to be within the Portuguese sphere. In fact, Portuguese under João Alvares Fagundes attempted to colonize the area in the 1520s, but the attempt failed. The Tavios people from Terra Nova, being often described as sooty or dark colored, might well be regarded sometimes as negros rather than as indios. This will be discussed in a later chapter. Americans were usually regarded as pardos or loros. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Okay, I want to highlight that, and I also want to highlight the Tavio peoples that protected basically this area of Terra Nova from being invaded, right? That's what I'm reading here. Okay. Terra Nova fell outside of the realm of Spain for a time and was thought to be Portuguese. Okay, in fact, this guy tried, but he failed. And that is notable. Okay, the Tavio peoples. So the Americans were usually regarded as pardos, Portuguese, by the Portuguese, right? Or loros by the Spanish in terms of color in the early periods of 1492 to the 1600s. But negro was also used for them. There you go. So these Spanish and Portuguese people referred to the Americans as pardo, loros, or negro, synonymous terms. Okay. The Terra Nova slave trade helps to explain the early depopulation of Newfoundland and the ease of the subsequent extinction of the American native inhabitants by the English. The second source of slaves after 1500s was the Caribbean region. Which very soon included the adjacent coast of South America, Florida, Carolina, and Mesoamerica. Many Americans were taken as slaves to the east, to Spain and to the Canary Islands, often as a result of the direct authorization of the crown. In 1499, for example, Vicente Yáñez Pinzón was authorized to discover islands and mainland in the Indies, and perhaps was given to take all manners of slaves, Negroes and loros, or others who in Spain are held as slaves. Vos facemos merced de toda manera de esclavos negros, loros o otros de los que en España son tenidos por esclavos, que por razón lo deben ser. The fuck? Moreover, the authorization given by Ferdinand and Isabella to Rodrigo de Bastidas, June 1500s, allowed for the importation of slaves to Spain who were Negroes and loros, who in the kingdoms of Castilla were held and reputed for slaves, of whom the crown was to receive a quarter share. A similar clause was inserted to another authorization of the same year. Speaking of the late 1499s to the 1503 expeditions to northern South America, Jose Antonio Sacco states that one of the objects of these expeditions was that of robbing human beings in order to sell them as slaves. The expeditions were to obtain slaves from among the Negroes and or loros who lived in the discovered lands. As we shall see in a later chapter, loro was regularly applied as a color term for Americans, while Negro was also used, but in this case the usage meant simply that any brown or black people found could be enslaved if people of similar status were already held as slaves in Spain. God damn. Hella loopholes. A series of voyages then ensued, including that of Alonso de Ojeda, who in 1500 disembarked more than 200 American slaves at Cadiz. Amerigo Vespucci also reports having sold more than 200 Americans in Spain, but didn't they say they named America after this guy? Some bullshit. Brought more than 200 slaves in Spain, but some authorities feel he was simply reporting on the Ojeda expedition. So he's taking credit from this guy? Is that what they're saying? In 1500s, Yáñez Pinzón captured 36 Americans in northern Brazil, as well as some from other places. These were landed at Palos, Spain, where a legal dispute ensued. It seems that Pinzón had promised one slave from his expedition to Diego Prieto. When he did not receive a slave, Prieto seized one of his American slaves of Pinzón in Palos. In order to settle the dispute, Pinzón offered to pay Prieto the value of another common slave, and the king commanded that this be done. This royal decree of June 20, 1501, shows that the crown was ready to accept the enslavement of Americans in Spain, in spite of several exceptions noted elsewhere. That's noteworthy. In 1499, Diego de Lepe also departed from Palos and proceeded to enslave Americans in the Amazon region and the Gulf of Paria. The slaves were turned over to Bishop Juan Rodriguez de Fonseca in Spain. Sheesh. The slaves were turned over to Juan Rodriguez de Fonseca in Spain. Interestingly, an American from Maranhão, or the Amazon. An American from Maranhão. This is Brazil, right? An American from Maranhão, or Maranhão, or the Amazon, showed up in Seville in the 1500s. He was named Pastor, age 13 or 14, color loro, and sold for 10,000 maravedis. God damn, that sounds like a lot. 10,000 maravedis. In 1501, Cristobal Guerra and his brother Luis brought a large number of slaves from Paria, the Isla Margarita, and other areas to Spain. These slaves benefited, however, from an order to enslave only Americans taken in just war. And Guerra was ordered to return them. These slaves benefited, however, from an order to enslave only Americans taken in just war, and Guerra was ordered to return them at his own cost. On the other hand, in 1503, Juan de la Costa sailed to the Cartagena region, seized 600 Americans, the majority of whom were sent to Spain with Luis Guerra, brother or other relation, to Cristobal Guerra Costa. Cristobal Guerra. Costa went on to seize other Americans in the Gulf of Uraba. It would appear that if the Americans resisted, as many did, then just war could be alleged and enslavement became legal. Okay. It would appear that if Americans resisted, as many did, then just war could be alleged and enslavement became legal. That's crazy. So you say, nah, I'm good, I don't want to be a part of this, or nah, fuck out of here. Both statements are considered resisting, right? So that they can snatch you up. Same. Cause and effect, with bullshit rules in between. Okay. Moreover, just war. Moreover, as a result of the above incidents, in which several Spaniards were killed, the crown was persuaded in 1503 to authorize the enslavement of the alleged Caribes of Cartagena. In 1504, a royal decree stated that rebel Indians were to be enslaved, a portion going to the government. With the death of Isabel that same year, no restraint existed. In 1512, for example, Ferdinand authorized the enslavement of Borican natives, with the F being branded on their fronts and with the fifth part going to the crown. After 1510, Spanish slave raiding reached out increasingly towards the outer islands of the Caribbean and the adjacent inlands and the adjacent mainlands. Much of the raiding was designed to meet the labor needs of Haiti, where the native population were being greatly reduced. But numerous Spanish expeditions, such as those of Magellan, Sebastian Cabot, and Gomez, captured Americans who were taken to Spain or who died en route. Cabot also purchased 50 to 60 slaves from the Portuguese in Brazil for later sale in Seville. By the 1520s, slave raiding in Florida and the Carolina coast area was common also. It is not necessary here to review all the data relative to the enslavement of Americans in Panama, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Mexico, Peru, and other countries. There is sufficient evidence to indicate that at least through the 1550s, large numbers of slaves were procured and shipped to various locations. Sacco notes that King Ferdinand had been considering the large-scale introduction of American slaves into Spain. In a dispatch of July 3, 1510, he asked several royal officials what profits might be derived from shipping slaves for sale in Spain. But the rapid decline in the native population of Haiti forced Ferdinand to change his opinion. By decree of July 21, 1511, Ferdinand ordered Columbus that no American slaves could be sent to Castile. This was to prevent the depopulation of the islands. Because the Spaniards did not abide by the order, as was customary according to Sacco, the king strengthened his opposition in 1512, imposing a fine and the loss of the slaves sent. This order was also not completely obeyed, and other orders had to be issued in 1528, 1543, and 1556. But the crown also vacillated in its policies. An order of 1526 prohibited the capture of natives and their shipment to Spain without license. So now you need a license to ship them. They were to be returned unless the license had been obtained. In 1530, further American enslavement was prohibited. However, violations were common, and the ban was lifted in 1534. 2 years later, a decree again prohibited the shipment of American slaves to Spain unless accompanied by a document issued by the provincial governor giving his approval. A decree of 1543 prohibited the taking of free or enslaved Americans from one province to another in the Indies. Okay, let's go back. Now, efforts were also made to enforce some of the above provisions. In 1529, the officials of Seville were ordered to facilitate the verification of the legal status of Americans introduced there. In 1531, arriving ships were to be examined for clandestine slaves. Decrees of 1536 and 1538 ordered the examination of the proof of slave status. Finally, in May of 1549, the officials of Seville were commissioned to liberate the Americans in Spain in a manner similar to what was then being attempted in the Americas. Okay, I like that. Especially in the years around 1500, some Americans were actually freed and returned to the Caribbean from Spain. But the numbers seem few in comparison with those actually shipped. In 1541, the Bishop of Santa Maria, now Colombia, wrote to Emperor Charles V that in that region se habían vendido públicamente muchos indios exportados de Perú y que los castellanos que allí tenían repartimientos vendían sus indios sacando otros muchos para Castilla con el objeto de servirse de ellos, lo cual se hacía con facultad de los que gobernaban. Thus, Spaniards were exporting American slaves from Peru to Colombia, and many were being sent to Spain with the help of officials and in spite of laws to the contrary. The new laws of 1542 which supposedly ended several forms of slavery, American slavery, did not immediately result in the suspension of the slave trade or in the shipment of Americas to Spain. On December 18th, 1547, a royal official wrote from Santo Domingo that contra el mandado de vuestra majesté se sacan indios, especialmente mujeres, y se venden públicamente en Sevilla, y de do llevan muchos de tierra firma, do se venden en almoneda de consentirlo en Sevilla, nacen el atrevimiento de aquí. Alright, what was notable here? This was in 1547. Laws of okay, let's continue. Thus, in 1547, American slaves, especially females, were still being sold in Seville, and the acceptance of such sales in the latter city gave birth to the impudence of Spaniards in the Indies, who continued to ship American slaves in defiance of the laws. During this period, the northern coast of South America seems to have served as a major source of slaves, with slave ships arriving at Haiti from Paria and Cumana as late as 1544. Clearly, the legislation enacted by the Spanish crown at various times to control or prevent certain types of American enslavement was only partially effective. One of the major objectives of the early legislation was to prevent the diminishing of the labor pool in the Indies by shipments to Europe, rather than to end slavery as such. That's true. Yeah, you can't take our supply away and send them to other places in demand of them. We got them here, we're keeping them here. That's the thought. So it wasn't so much about ending slavery as it was about keeping the island stocked up with their own slaves. Alright. Much has been made by writers of the significance of this legislation, but even the famous laws of 1542 did not bring an end to enslavement. First, it must be noted that the Spaniards developed several categories of partial slaves, categories which continue to allow for effective enslavement. Yeah, that's what I was reading in the beginning, all those different Saracen categories. Damn. Thus, there were naborias, slaves who could not be resold, useless Americans, natives who could be moved from an island without gold to a place of labor shortage, apportioned Americans, natives who were apportioned to Spaniards as laborers or later as tribute-paying retainers, chichimecos, natives of dispersed living settlements who could be forcibly reduced to missionary control and mandatory labor, and rebeldes, such as all alleged Caribs, the Mapuches of Chile, and others who could be legally enslaved at various times even after 1542, all of which allowed for quasi-slavery or actual slavery to continue to exist. An Italian, Girolamo Benzoni, was in the Indies from 1541 to 1556, and he later wrote, let's see what he was talking about after I highlight his name. He later wrote that all the slaves that the Spaniards catch in these provinces are sent to Cubagua. The slaves are all marked in the face and on the arms by a hot iron marked with the mark C for Caribe. When ships arrive from Spain, they barter these Indians for wine, flour, biscuits, and other requisite things, and even when some of the Indian women are pregnant by these same Spaniards, they sell them without any conscience. Then the merchants carry them elsewhere and sell them again. Others are sent to the islands of Spagnula, Haiti, filling with them some large vessels built like caravels. Benzoni also noted that although an almost infinite number of the inhabitants of the mainland have been brought to these islands as slaves, they have nearly all since died.